Some people think a gate is just a piece of steel. The wrong people always find out it's a line they were never supposed to cross. The first thing I heard that morning wasn't the birds settling over my ranch. It was the low growl of a white Cadillac Escalade climbing the gravel road like it owned every inch beneath its tires. The sound rolled through the quiet Texas morning before the sun had fully cleared the oak trees, followed by the familiar crunch of limestone gravel that always made my stomach tighten. I didn't need to look outside to know who it was. Brenda Whitmore never believed rules applied to her, especially when those rules belonged to someone else. By the time I stepped onto my front porch with a cup of black coffee still warming my hands, the smell of fresh concrete drifted through the cool air, mixing with cedar, damp soil, and the faint scent of cut hay from the north pasture. The new stone wall stood exactly where the county survey markers said it belonged. Every block had been measured twice. Every permit had been approved. Every inch of it rested on land my grandfather bought more than 70 years ago. Brenda hadn't seen it yet. She was too busy looking at her phone while driving straight toward the entrance she'd been using as her personal shortcut for almost 6 months. You could almost hear her confidence before you saw her expression. That expensive SUV never slowed down anymore. Why would it? She'd driven through my ranch gate so many times she treated it like another lane in her private neighborhood. She ignored the no trespassing signs. She ignored the cameras. She ignored the sheriff's warning. Most of all, she ignored the fact that private property isn't a suggestion in Texas. The tires rolled closer. Gravel scattered beneath the weight of nearly 3 tons of polished luxury. Then came the sound I'd been waiting to hear. A long screech of brakes echoed across the pasture as Brenda finally looked up. Her sunglasses slipped halfway down her nose. Her mouth hung open. Instead of the open driveway she'd expected, a 12-foot limestone wall stretched across the entire entrance behind my restored ranch gate, finished with heavy cedar fencing and black steel posts sunk deep into reinforced concrete. Decorative, elegant, completely legal, and absolutely impossible to drive through. The silence afterward felt louder than the brakes. Steam drifted from beneath the Escalade's hood, while dust floated lazily through the morning sunlight. I took one slow sip of coffee without saying a word. Brenda stared at the wall, then at me, then back at the wall again as if reality had somehow betrayed her. She climbed out of the SUV wearing designer boots that immediately collected pale ranch dust. Her perfectly styled hair barely moved in the breeze, but the smile she usually wore at every HOA meeting disappeared faster than morning fog. "You can't do this," she shouted across the gate. I rested one hand against the weathered cedar post my grandfather had installed decades earlier and smiled for the first time in weeks. "Actually," I said, "the county says I can." What Brenda didn't know was that this wall wasn't revenge. It was the final page of a story she'd been writing herself every single morning. She chose convenience over respect, entitlement over law, and someone else's property over common sense. And that story had started long before the first stone was ever laid. My name is Ethan Walker, and everything changed the day my grandfather handed me a rusted gate key and told me that land remembers exactly who protects it. My grandfather, Walter Walker, used to say that fences keep livestock in, but gates reveal character. I never understood what he meant until years after he was gone. Our ranch sits on 183 acres just outside Fredericksburg, Texas, where the mornings smell like cedar, mesquite, and damp limestone after a cool night. The land has been in my family since 1953, when my grandfather returned home from the Korean War with little more than a pickup truck, a stubborn work ethic, and a handshake agreement that eventually became the deed folded inside an old metal lockbox. Every fence post, every cattle guard, every winding trail across those rolling hills carries a story that started long before I was born. I grew up fixing broken water lines, repairing barbed wire, and learning that ownership is not about putting your name on something. It is about showing up every day, even when nobody is watching. My father believed the same thing until cancer took him when I was 28. After that, it was just me and the ranch. I studied civil engineering at Texas A&M University because I loved understanding how things stayed standing through storms. Concrete, drainage, retaining walls, foundations. Most people looked at blueprints and saw lines. I saw promises. A structure either respected the laws of nature or it eventually failed. People were not much different. By 42, I had built a comfortable career designing commercial retaining systems across Central Texas, but every evening I drove back to the ranch before sunset. The gravel under my truck tires sounded like home. The old windmill still creaked the same way it had when I was 10 years old. The cattle still wandered toward the stock pond at almost exactly the same hour every afternoon. Life out there moved with quiet purpose, and I liked it that way. The entrance gate mattered more than anyone outside my family could understand. My grandfather welded it himself from heavy steel pipe nearly 50 years ago. The cedar posts had been replaced twice, but the original ironwork still carried tiny hammer marks from his own hands. Every holiday, every birthday, every family reunion began by driving through that gate. When my father taught me how to drive, he made me stop before opening it because he said respect begins before you cross a boundary. Even after installing an automatic opener years later, I kept the old brass key hanging inside my workshop. Not because I needed it, but because memories deserve maintenance too. Most people passing the property saw an old ranch entrance and kept driving. Brenda Whitmore saw something completely different. She saw 2 minutes she could save on her drive between the Willow Creek Estate subdivision and the state highway. Those 2 minutes became the excuse she repeated to herself often enough that she eventually believed convenience created permission. At first, I honestly thought it was an honest mistake. A wrong turn. A confused delivery driver. Then I noticed fresh tire tracks cutting across the gravel every morning before sunrise. Dust settled differently. The gate sometimes stood half open when I knew I had latched it the night before. One afternoon, I found a crushed soda cup beside the cattle guard and expensive tire marks leading straight across my pasture road toward the neighborhood behind the ridge. That was the moment I realized somebody had quietly turned part of my family's history into their personal shortcut, and they expected me to accept it as though 70 years of ownership meant less than their morning schedule. The first time I actually met Brenda Whitmore, she smiled before she spoke, and somehow that made the conversation feel colder. It was a bright Tuesday morning in early April. The smell of fresh mulch drifted across the entrance to Willow Creek Estates while sprinklers clicked rhythmically across perfectly trimmed lawns. I had stopped at the local hardware store for fence staples when I noticed the same white Escalade pulling into the parking lot. Brenda stepped out wearing an expensive navy blazer, oversized sunglasses, and the kind of polished confidence that made everyone around her seem like unpaid employees. Before I could even reach my truck, she walked directly toward me as though we had already scheduled a meeting. "You are Ethan Walker, right?" she asked with a practiced smile. I nodded. "Good. We have been meaning to talk about your access road." I remember blinking for a second because she said your access road the same way someone might say your mailbox or your flower bed. Casual. Ordinary. As though the ranch entrance my family had owned for generations was simply another neighborhood issue waiting to be discussed. Brenda folded her arms and looked toward the hills behind me. Quite a few residents have started using that road. It really helps traffic during the morning rush. We appreciate your cooperation. Cooperation. That single word echoed in my head all the way home. Nobody had ever asked permission. Nobody had ever knocked on my door. They had simply started driving through private property and eventually convinced themselves that silence meant approval. I answered as calmly as I could. "It is private land, Brenda. The road is not open to public traffic." Her smile barely changed. That might have been true years ago, but communities evolve. Then she handed me a glossy folder carrying the Willow Creek Estates logo embossed in silver. Inside were proposals for what she called a shared community access improvement initiative, decorative entrance lighting, directional signs, landscaping recommendations, even a sketch showing my ranch entrance connected to subdivision roads as if the decision had already been made. I could smell fresh printer ink as I flipped through the pages. Not one document mentioned ownership. Not one page included my signature. Every illustration quietly assumed my property belonged to everyone. I closed the folder and handed it back. "No." She laughed softly, almost sympathetically. "You should think about the bigger picture, Ethan. Property values improve when neighbors work together." Then she climbed back into her Escalade and drove away, leaving the faint scent of expensive perfume hanging in the warm spring air. I watched the vehicle disappear around the bend before driving home. The next morning the tire tracks were back. Then the next day, and the day after that. Soon it was not just Brenda. Landscaping trucks rolled through before sunrise. Delivery vans cut across the gravel without slowing down. Parents in sport utility vehicles waved at each other while crossing my cattle guard as though they were driving through a neighborhood boulevard instead of a working ranch. One Saturday afternoon, I counted 11 different vehicles in less than 30 minutes. Dust floated across my front pasture while my cattle drifted farther away from the noise. Every passing engine left another layer of gravel scattered across the entrance my grandfather had built with his own hands. That was when I realized Brenda had never intended to ask permission. She had already decided that repetition would eventually replace ownership, and she expected me to grow tired before she ever considered stopping. I decided to handle everything the way my father would have, quietly, politely, and with documentation instead of emotion. The following Monday, I installed 2 new security cameras on cedar posts overlooking the entrance. They were not hidden. I wanted everyone driving through to see them. Small black housings against weathered wood, blinking softly every night after sunset. Then I replaced the faded "No Trespassing" sign with a larger reflective one that could be read from nearly 200 feet away. I even added another sign beneath it that read, "Private Ranch Road. No public access." The aluminum still smelled like fresh paint when I tightened the final bolt. For exactly one day, I thought the problem might finally solve itself. Then Tuesday morning arrived. At 6:43, Brenda's Escalade rolled past both signs without slowing down. 6 minutes later, a landscaping trailer followed her. Before 7 o'clock, 3 more vehicles crossed my cattle guard as if the signs were decoration instead of legal notice. Watching the footage that evening, I noticed something that bothered me even more than the trespassing itself. Every driver hesitated for just a second before continuing. They saw the warnings. They simply chose to ignore them because someone had convinced them they had permission. I drove into town and spoke with Deputy Ryan Foster at the Gillespie County Sheriff's Office. Ryan had known my family for years and listened patiently while I showed him the recordings. He nodded, rubbed the edge of his coffee mug, and sighed. "Ethan, you are absolutely within your rights. But before we start issuing citations, send a formal notice. Make it crystal clear. Give them every chance to do the right thing." That sounded fair to me. The next morning, I mailed certified letters to the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association and addressed one directly to Brenda Whitmore. The letter was respectful, simple, and impossible to misunderstand. It explained that the ranch road was privately owned, that no easement existed, and that all unauthorized traffic needed to stop immediately. I included copies of the county parcel map and photographs of the posted signs. A week passed. No response. Instead, I found something waiting. Inside my mailbox that Saturday afternoon. It was a thick envelope carrying the Willow Creek Estates logo. The paper felt unusually expensive between my fingers, and the sharp smell of fresh toner drifted upward as I unfolded the letter. According to the Homeowners Association, my entrance created what they called an unreasonable traffic inconvenience for neighborhood residents. They requested that I keep the gate open during peak commuting hours in the interest of community cooperation. At the bottom sat Brenda's signature, bold and confident, as though she genuinely believed she had authority over land that was not even inside her subdivision. I actually laughed out loud standing beside my mailbox. Then I stopped laughing when I looked beyond the gate. Fresh tire tracks had already crossed the gravel again while I was reading the letter. It was no longer just about convenience. It was about entitlement becoming policy. A few days later, I returned home from inspecting a commercial retaining wall project in San Antonio and immediately noticed something different. Bright orange survey flags had appeared along the edge of my ranch road. Someone had pushed them into the ground only a few feet from the cattle guard. They fluttered gently in the afternoon breeze as though a construction crew planned to return. I pulled one from the soil and brushed the loose dirt from its metal stake. There were no county markings, no permit numbers, no engineering company name, just anonymous flags quietly suggesting that somebody had already started measuring property they did not own. The orange survey flags bothered me far more than the tire tracks ever had because they told me someone was no longer pretending. Someone had started planning. Early the next morning, I loaded every document I could find into a weathered leather briefcase that had belonged to my father. The original deed, the updated county survey, tax records, boundary plats, easement searches, decades of carefully preserved paperwork that smelled faintly of old paper and cedar from sitting inside the same lockbox for generations. Instead of driving to another construction project, I headed straight to the Gillespie County Clerk's Office. The courthouse looked exactly as it always had, with limestone walls glowing softly beneath the Texas sun and old oak trees casting long shadows across the parking lot. Inside, the air carried the familiar scent of polished wood and aging records. Melissa, one of the county clerks, recognized my last name before I even reached the counter. After explaining everything, she disappeared into the records room and returned nearly half an hour later carrying several oversized map books and a thick folder of archived surveys. We spent the next 2 hours comparing every recorded easement affecting my property. Utility easements, drainage easements, electrical access, pipeline rights. There were plenty of legal encumbrances exactly where they should have been. One thing was missing from every single page. There had never been a public access easement across my ranch. Not once. Not even in the oldest records dating back decades. Melissa looked at me over the stack of documents and quietly said, "If someone is telling people they have a legal right to use your road, they are not getting that authority from county records." That sentence stayed with me all afternoon. Before leaving, I requested certified copies of every relevant document. Then I drove directly to the county engineering office where another surprise waited for me. Because of my work as a civil engineer, several people there knew me professionally. After reviewing the property maps, one of the engineers pointed to the entrance area and asked a simple question. "Have you ever considered installing a permanent retaining feature along this frontage?" I looked closer at the zoning notes. The county regulations clearly allowed decorative stone retaining walls, landscape barriers, reinforced entrance structures, and protective bollards as long as they remained entirely inside the surveyed property lines and met setback requirements. I read the ordinance twice, just to be certain. Every requirement was straightforward. Proper permits, engineered plans, drainage compliance, visibility standards. Nothing prohibited strengthening the entrance to private property. Nothing required leaving. An open path for unauthorized vehicles. Driving back to the ranch that evening, the sunset painted the hills deep shades of orange and gold, while the familiar smell of warm cedar drifted through the open truck windows. For the first time in weeks, I was not thinking about Brenda. I was thinking like an engineer. Every problem has constraints. Every constraint creates a solution if you are patient enough to study it. When I pulled into my driveway, fresh tire marks curved through the gravel again, but this time they did not make me angry. They confirmed exactly where every measurement needed to begin. I parked beside the old workshop, unlocked the drafting table my father had built, spread the certified surveys across its scarred wooden surface, and sharpened a pencil. The quiet clicking of the ceiling fan mixed with the distant sound of cattle settling into the pasture as I drew my very first line. It was not the beginning of an argument. It was the beginning of a structure that would stand exactly where the law said it belonged, and once it was finished, every shortcut would finally meet a boundary that could not be ignored. Once I committed to the plan, I treated it like every engineering project I had ever managed. Emotion stayed outside the drawings. Measurements did not care about opinions, and concrete certainly did not respond to arguments. During the next week, I finalized the construction plans, submitted them to the county, and answered every technical question the permit office requested. Drainage calculations, footing depth, setback measurements, material specifications, sightline clearances. Everything had to be perfect because I knew the smallest mistake would become Brenda's favorite talking point. When the approval notice finally arrived, I unfolded the stamped documents on my kitchen table and smiled at the neat blue seal in the corner. It was not flashy, but it carried more authority than every letter the Homeowners Association had ever mailed me. 2 days later, a local contractor named Mike Hernandez pulled into the ranch with a crew I had worked with on commercial retaining wall projects for years. They understood precision and more. Importantly, they respected property lines. The first morning began with the steady rhythm of survey equipment clicking into place while bright yellow strings stretched neatly between wooden stakes. Fresh limestone dust drifted across the entrance as the skid steer carefully removed the top layer of gravel. The smell of diesel mixed with damp earth while steel tape measures snapped back into their cases every few minutes. Every dimension matched the county survey exactly. I checked them myself before anyone poured a single ounce of concrete. We installed reinforced footings deep enough to support a lifetime of Texas weather, then positioned heavy steel bollards inside the foundation where they would disappear beneath decorative stonework. To anyone passing by, it would simply look like an elegant ranch entrance designed to complement the landscape. Underneath, however, every element had been engineered to remain exactly where it belonged for decades. Throughout construction, I noticed vehicles slowing down along the county road. Drivers rolled their windows down, trying to figure out what was happening. Brenda passed twice during the first afternoon. The first time she slowed just enough to stare. The second time she actually stopped near the entrance. I watched from across the pasture as she stepped out of her Escalade, looked at the construction equipment, then pulled out her phone. A few minutes later, she drove away without saying a word. The following morning, another certified envelope arrived from the Homeowners Association. This one claimed that my construction activity might interfere with neighborhood traffic flow and requested that I temporarily suspend work until the board could review my plans. I read the letter while standing beside a pallet of freshly delivered limestone blocks still cool from the overnight air. Then I folded it neatly, placed it back inside the envelope, and continued helping Mike verify the reinforcement spacing. The county had already completed its review. There was nothing left for the Homeowners Association to approve because they had never possessed that authority in the first place. Day after day, the wall slowly rose from the foundation. One carefully fitted stone after another transformed the entrance into something that looked as though it had always belonged there. We installed matching cedar fencing, black steel hardware, subtle landscape lighting, and a new automatic gate tied into upgraded security cameras that quietly recorded everything entering and leaving the property. By the end of the second week, even I had to admit the entrance looked better than it ever had before. It honored my grandfather's original craftsmanship while adding the strength modern engineering could provide. As I stood back that evening with the smell of fresh mortar still hanging in the warm Texas air, I noticed fresh tire tracks stopping several feet short of the unfinished entrance before turning around for the first time in months. Brenda had finally realized something permanent was taking shape. She simply believed there would still be enough room left for her to squeeze through when the job was finished. The final inspection happened on a cool Friday afternoon beneath a bright Texas sky, so clear it almost looked painted. The county inspector walked the entire frontage with a clipboard tucked beneath one arm, occasionally stopping to compare measurements against the approved plans. I followed a few steps behind while Mike Hernandez answered questions about reinforcement, drainage, and footing depth. Every answer matched the drawings because every inch of the project had been built exactly as designed. After nearly an hour, the inspector smiled, signed the completion paperwork, and handed me a stamped copy before driving away in his county truck. I slid the document into my briefcase beside the surveys and permits. That stack of papers had quietly become the strongest part of the entire wall. Over the weekend, we finished the last details. Fresh cedar boards framed the entrance with a warm honey color that contrasted perfectly against the natural limestone. Low landscape lights illuminated the stonework without creating glare for passing traffic. The upgraded security cameras captured crystal clear footage from multiple angles, and the automatic gate opened smoothly with a soft mechanical hum that sounded almost effortless. By Sunday evening, the construction equipment had disappeared, the gravel had been swept clean, and the entrance looked as though it had belonged there for decades. Monday morning arrived with the familiar smell of dew settling over the pasture and mockingbirds singing from the fence posts. I carried my coffee onto the porch just before sunrise, not because I expected trouble, but because routines have a way of revealing the truth. At exactly 6:43, the distant growl of a large sport utility vehicle echoed across the ranch. I recognized the sound before I could see the headlights. Brenda was running on the same schedule she had followed for months. She rounded the bend without slowing, confident that habit would once again carry her across land she had never owned. Then she looked up. The elegant stone wall stretched proudly along the entrance, blending so naturally into the landscape that it seemed impossible to imagine the property without it. The reinforced gate stood closed between heavy cedar posts, while the decorative stone barriers continued seamlessly to both sides. There was no opening to slip through, no extra space to borrow, and no imaginary shortcut waiting beyond the gravel. I watched her brake firmly and bring the Escalade to a controlled stop several feet in front of the entrance. Dust drifted slowly around the vehicle before settling back onto the road. Brenda climbed out, removed her sunglasses, and stared at the wall in complete disbelief. She walked several steps toward the gate, studying the stonework as though she expected it to disappear if she looked closely enough. Then she noticed the small bronze plaque mounted beside the entrance. Private property. Constructed under Gillespie County permit. No public access. She turned toward me with the same expression I had seen in the hardware store months earlier, except this time the confidence was gone. "You planned this," she said. I nodded once. "I followed the law." She glanced around as if searching for another route before finally pulling out her phone. I could see her taking photographs of the wall, the gate, and the permit plaque, while the security cameras quietly recorded every movement. A few passing drivers slowed to admire the new entrance, then continued along the public road without giving it a second thought. Within minutes, Brenda returned to her vehicle, performed a careful three-point turn, and drove back the way she had come. For the first time since this entire situation had begun, the gravel beyond my gate remained perfectly undisturbed, and the only sound left in the morning air was the wind moving gently through the cedar trees. By lunchtime, the entire neighborhood seemed to know the shortcut was gone. I did not have to check social media to figure that out, because I could see it unfolding right from my front porch. Cars that had spent months cutting across my ranch now stayed on the county road where they belonged. The dust that usually drifted across my pasture every weekday morning settled back onto the gravel, leaving the entrance cleaner than it had been in months. Even my cattle wandered closer to the front field again, no longer startled every few minutes by unfamiliar engines. The ranch finally sounded like a ranch instead of a commuter route. Brenda, however, was not ready to accept reality. 3 days later, another certified envelope arrived. This one informed me that the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association believed my new entrance created unnecessary inconvenience for neighborhood residents and requested that I attend the next board meeting to discuss possible solutions. I almost admired the wording. They never admitted the road had been private all along. Instead, they acted as though losing access to someone else's property had somehow become my responsibility to fix. I decided to attend, not because I owed anyone an explanation, but because I wanted every conversation to happen in daylight with witnesses. The meeting took place inside the subdivision clubhouse on a warm Thursday evening. The room smelled faintly of fresh coffee and floor polish, while ceiling fans hummed quietly overhead. Residents filled nearly every chair, many of them people I had never met despite living only a few miles away. Brenda opened the discussion with polished confidence, describing the ranch entrance as a long-standing community route that had recently become unavailable. She spoke carefully, avoiding words like private property or trespassing. When she finished, several board members looked toward me. I stood, carried my briefcase to the front table, and quietly removed the same documents that had followed me through this entire process. First came the original deed, then the certified county survey, then the easement records confirming no public access had ever existed. Finally, I placed the signed construction permit and final inspection approval beside the rest. I did not raise my voice. I simply walked everyone through the timeline, explaining when unauthorized traffic began, when certified notices were mailed, when cameras documented repeated crossings, and when county officials confirmed my legal rights. One resident asked whether the Homeowners Association had ever received my certified letter. Brenda hesitated just long enough for the room to become noticeably quieter. Another board member requested copies of the documents. As they reviewed the county records, expressions around the room slowly changed from confidence to confusion. Several neighbors admitted they had honestly believed the road belonged to the subdivision because that was what they had been told. No one argued after reading the surveys. There was nothing to argue with. Facts have a way of ending conversations that opinions cannot. Before the meeting ended, the board voted to discontinue any claim involving my property and instructed the association attorney to notify residents that the ranch road was private and had never been authorized for neighborhood access. Brenda remained silent through the final vote, staring at the stack of county records resting in the center of the table. As I packed my briefcase, one older homeowner stopped me near the exit and quietly apologized for using the shortcut. I shook his hand and thanked him. Driving home beneath a sky filled with Texas stars, I realized the wall had never been the real victory. It simply gave the truth a permanent place to stand while every assumption built around convenience quietly collapsed on its own. A few months have passed since that meeting, and every morning the ranch greets me the way it did when I was a boy. The wind carries the scent of cedar through the front pasture. Meadowlarks settle on the fence posts just after sunrise. The gravel stays smooth until my own truck rolls across it, and the old windmill turns slowly above the stock tank without competing against the sound of hurried commuters chasing a shorter drive. Peace returns so quietly that I almost forgot how loud the constant traffic had become. Sometimes I walk to the entrance before starting work, coffee in one hand and my grandfather's brass gate key in the other. I still carry it, even though the automatic gate has long since replaced the old lock. The key reminds me that some things deserve to be protected simply because the people before us sacrificed to build them. The stone wall has already begun blending into the landscape. Native grasses have filled the spaces around the limestone. Young live oaks are taking root beside the entrance, and climbing vines have started softening the edges of the cedar fence. Visitors often assume the entire structure has been there for decades because it looks as though it belongs exactly where it stands. That might be my favorite part of the entire project. It never feels like an act of defiance. It feels like the ranch quietly completed a sentence that had been waiting to be finished for years. I still see Brenda from time to time around town. We have crossed paths at the feed store, the hardware store, and once outside the county courthouse. We nod politely and continue on with our day. There are no dramatic confrontations, no raised voices, and no lingering arguments because there is nothing left to debate. The property lines remain exactly where they have always been, and everyone now understands where they begin and where they end. I have even noticed that several Willow Creek residents now use the public county road without complaint. A few have stopped by the ranch entrance to compliment the stonework, and more than one neighbor has apologized for believing rumors instead of checking the facts. I accepted every apology because holding on to resentment would only have built another kind of wall, one that never protects anything worthwhile. Looking back, I realized this was never really about saving 2 minutes on a morning commute. It was about what happens when confidence slowly convinces someone that repeated behavior becomes permission. It never does. A shortcut driven often enough does not become an easement. An assumption repeated loudly enough does not become ownership. And a confident opinion never outweighs a recorded deed filed at the county courthouse. That lesson cost me months of patience, stacks of paperwork, and more than a few early mornings. But it also reminded me why my grandfather valued quiet persistence over loud arguments. He understood something I only fully appreciate now. The strongest boundaries are not built from anger. They are built from preparation, honesty, craftsmanship, and the willingness to let the truth stand on its own. Every time I close the gate behind me and hear the gentle click of the latch settling into place, I think about his words all over again. Land remembers exactly who protects it. So do the people who choose to respect it. And every sunrise that shines across those limestone walls reminds me that justice does not always arrive with sirens, headlines, or dramatic speeches. Sometimes it arrives one carefully measured stone at a time, standing quietly in the exact place where it always belonged.